The word goodbye had barely formed on Stella Dawson's lips when Hugh Carson's boots hit the stable floor, and his hands found the cinch strap on his roan gelding. She stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek livery, her traveling bag clutched against her chest like a shield, her eyes red and swollen from a night of crying she had refused to let anyone witness. The morning light came sharp and merciless through the gaps in the stable walls, cutting gold lines across the straw-covered floor, illuminating the rigid set of Hugh's shoulders as he worked the buckle with fingers that knew this task better than they knew anything soft. "You did not hear a single word I said," Stella told him, her voice cracking along the edges. "I said goodbye, Hugh. I said it plainly." He did not turn around. "I heard you fine." "Then why are you?" "Because hearing something and accepting it are two entirely different things." He pulled the strap through and checked the saddle with one firm palm. "Hand me that bridle." Stella did not hand him anything. She pressed herself harder into the door frame, furious and terrified and heartbroken all at once, because she had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the dark of the boarding house room, told herself she would be composed, dignified, final. She had written a letter and burned it. She had written another and left it unfinished. In the end, she had come in person because she owed him that much, because whatever else could be said about Hugh Carson and the impossible situation between them, he deserved to hear it from her own mouth. And now he was saddling his horse. "This is exactly what I am running from," she said, and her voice was not composed or dignified. It was raw and shaking, and it gave away every truth she had been trying to bury. "This you deciding things. You moving before I am finished speaking." Hugh turned then. His face was not calm. It was the face of a man fighting something enormous inside himself, something that had been building for months, and whatever composure he normally wore like a second skin had been stripped entirely away. His eyes were the deep, serious gray of storm clouds over open plains, and they found her across the stable with an intensity that made her forget, for a moment, everything that had driven her to this door with her bag and her goodbye. "You want to know why I am saddling my horse, Stella?" His voice was low and measured, and it cost him something to keep it that way. "Because the last time I let someone I loved walk out of my life without fighting for them, I spent 4 years regretting every second of it. I am not doing that again. Not for you, not for anyone." The word loved hit her like a physical thing. She had not expected it, not spoken plainly, not without walls around it. She had expected argument. She had expected the cool, self-contained version of Hugh she had come to know in the first weeks after her arrival in Dusty Creek, the man who measured every word and gave away nothing. This was not that man. This was someone else entirely, and Stella realized with a horrible, sinking certainty that leaving was going to be far more complicated than she had planned. To understand why she had come to that stable door with a bag and a breaking heart, you have to go back 4 months, to the day the stagecoach rattled into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, carrying Stella Dawson and the wreckage of the life she had left behind in St. Louis. It was September of 1878, and the territory was the kind of wild that newspapers back east described in breathless, exaggerated terms that simultaneously attracted dreamers and terrified sensible people. The town of Dusty Creek sat at the edge of a broad valley flanked on the west by Red Mesa country and on the east by the beginning of a pine-covered mountain range. It was not a beautiful town in any manicured sense. The main street was rutted dirt that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it did not, which was most of the time. There was a general store, a sheriff's office that doubled as a jail, a doctor's office above the hardware store, a church still waiting for its second coat of whitewash, and 3 saloons, which told you something about the priorities of the men who had built the place. There was also, at the north end of town, a school. A 1-room schoolhouse with 8 uneven windows and a bell that only rang on 3 of its 4 strokes, but rang them clearly enough. It was the school that had brought Stella to Dusty Creek, though the circumstances surrounding that decision were considerably more complicated than a simple answer to a job advertisement. She had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis for 2 years before everything fell apart. She had been engaged, briefly and disastrously, to a man named Raymond Alcott, the son of the school board chairman, which was the kind of detail that ought to have warned her before she ever agreed to dinner with him. Raymond was handsome in the conventional, barbered way of men who knew they were handsome, and he had pursued her with a persistence that she had mistaken, in her late 20s and considerable loneliness, for passion. It had not been passion. It had been a dark, controlling need that she had not identified for what it was until the night he locked her inside his family's townhouse and told her she would not be returning to her teaching position because no wife of his would work. She had not married him. She had gotten out of that house through a downstairs window, and she had walked 14 blocks to her landlady's house in the November cold, and she had spent the following week constructing an exit from a life she no longer recognized as her own. The exit had taken the form of an advertisement in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, placed by the Dusty Creek School Board, seeking an experienced teacher willing to relocate to the New Mexico territory. The salary was modest. The description of the town was sparse. The distance between St. Louis and Dusty Creek was, in 1878, a genuine and considerable frontier crossing. Stella had written to them the same day she read the advertisement. The school board's letter of acceptance had come back signed by a woman named Edna Marsh, who turned out to be the most formidable person in Dusty Creek by a very wide margin and who, upon meeting Stella at the stagecoach stop, had looked her over with the calculating precision of a woman who had been surviving impossible circumstances for 3 decades and said, "You have better posture than the last one." Good. The children respond to posture. Stella had liked her immediately. The boarding house where Stella was given lodging belonged to a widow named Clara Finch, whose 2 grown daughters had married and left, and who maintained 4 guest rooms with a fierce, motherly pride that expressed itself primarily in extremely thick quilts and the best biscuits Stella had ever tasted. Clara was soft-spoken and perceptive, the kind of woman who watched people more than she spoke to them, and she had the particular talent of making a person feel both seen and safe, which was something Stella had been starving for without fully knowing it. Hugh Carson she met on her 3rd day in Dusty Creek. He had come to the school to repair a window frame that had been rotting since the previous spring. Edna had arranged it without ceremony, and Stella had arrived to open the school on a Monday morning to find a man on a ladder outside the east-facing windows, removing the old frame with a flat pry bar and a steady, unhurried efficiency that suggested he did not waste motion on anything. He was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked with their hands not for appearance but for necessity, with dark hair that had been cut recently but not recently enough, and the kind of weathered, angular face that looked older than its years without looking old. His eyes, she noticed when he finally came down from the ladder and knocked on the schoolhouse door to ask if she had seen where he'd left his hammer, were gray and direct and gave away nothing whatsoever. "Hugh Carson," he said, and held out his hand. "Stella Dawson," she said, and shook it. "You're the new teacher. You are very observant." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read, and she got the impression that the slight shift at the corner of his mouth might have been the beginning of a smile that he had long since disciplined out of himself. "The hammer," he said. "Have you seen it?" She had not seen his hammer. He found it on the ground beneath the window he had been working on, and they exchanged no further words that morning. But when she was arranging the children's slates on the desks later that afternoon, she looked out the newly repaired window at a clean, solid frame that would keep the cold out all winter, and she thought, without quite intending to, that whoever he was, he did careful, honest work. She did not see him again for nearly 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, Stella settled into the rhythms of Dusty Creek with a combination of practical determination and quiet grief. The school was her salvation in the most immediate sense. She threw herself into it with everything she had, because the children were genuinely hungry for learning, and because work was the only reliable thing she had ever found to keep the darker thoughts at bay. There were 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, the offspring of ranchers and miners, and the handful of shopkeepers who had made Dusty Creek their permanent home. They were rough-edged and wary in the way of children who had grown up in a place where the nearest large town was a 2-day ride, and where the unpredictability of weather and fortune was not an abstraction but a daily reality. They had seen hardship without needing to be told what it was. Stella understood them in a way she had not expected. She had grown up in Cincinnati, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who read novels aloud in the evenings, and her own childhood had been orderly and bookish and relatively safe, which meant that she had spent her adult life feeling obscurely out of place in the polished parlors of St. Louis society. These children, with their direct gazes and their practical questions and their occasional startling observations about the nature of the world, felt more real to her than anything had in years. She was in the general store on the second Thursday after her arrival, trying to determine whether the brown paper package on the shelf contained soda crackers or something less palatable, when a voice behind her said, "It's crackers. Mrs. Pendleton labels everything in brown paper and trusts everyone to remember what they've ordered." She turned and found Hugh Carson standing 3 feet away, holding a coil of wire rope under one arm and a jar of boot black in the other hand, looking entirely unembarrassed about having addressed a near stranger in the middle of a store. "That seems like a significant flaw in the system," Stella said. "She's been running it that way for 6 years. Nobody's complained yet. Perhaps nobody wants to offend her." "That," he said, and this time the almost smile was more definite, "is exactly right." They walked out of the store at the same time, which led to him walking in the same direction she was walking for approximately half a block before she asked him, more out of genuine curiosity than social obligation, how he knew about the brown paper labeling system. He explained that he had a ranch 3 miles east of town, that he came in for supplies every Thursday, that he had been buying crackers from Mrs. Pendleton since she opened her store. He asked how she was finding the school. She told him honestly that she was finding it wonderful and exhausting in equal measure. He said that sounded about right for teaching in Dusty Creek. They parted at the corner of Main and 2nd without ceremony, but Stella walked the remaining 2 blocks to the boarding house thinking about the quality of his attention. He had listened to her, not the polite, waiting for his turn listening she had grown accustomed to in St. Louis drawing rooms. He had actually listened, his gray eyes steady and present, as though what she was saying was information he wanted to have. It was such a small thing. It felt enormous. The second time they spoke at length, it was because of the trouble with Marcus Deal. Marcus Deal was the owner of the largest cattle operation within 40 miles of Dusty Creek, a man in his mid-50s with the square jaw and absolute self-certainty of someone who had never been seriously opposed. He sat on the town council. He had a great deal of money and a great deal of land, and the settled conviction that both of these facts gave him particular authority over matters in Dusty Creek, including the school curriculum. He had appeared at the schoolhouse door on a Friday afternoon in late September to inform Stella that he had reviewed the McGuffey readers she was using and found the later volumes unsuitable for children of the territory, specifically the passages concerning the rights of freedmen, which he felt would give the students ideas above their station. Stella had stood in her doorway and listened to him with a calm she had to work very hard to maintain, and then she had told him that the curriculum was determined by the school board and that any concerns he had should be directed to Edna Marsh. He had not liked that answer. She had closed the school door. She had not told anyone about the visit, because she was new and she was trying to be careful, and because she could handle Marcus Deal. What she had not anticipated was that he would return the following Monday and speak to 3 of her students' fathers in a way that resulted in those 3 students not appearing at school on Tuesday. She had gone to Edna Marsh that evening, and Edna had been furious in the contained, precise way of someone who has been fighting this particular battle for a long time. Marcus Deal has been trying to shrink this school since before he built his second barn, Edna said. He doesn't want educated workers. He wants compliant ones. Hugh Carson had been at Edna's house that evening because it turned out that he and Edna had known each other for years and that he was one of the people she trusted most in Dusty Creek. He had listened to the whole account while sitting in Edna's straight-backed parlor chair, and when Stella finished, he said, "I'll speak to Bill Hatch. He's one of the fathers. He's a reasonable man when Deal isn't standing next to him." "You do not need to get involved," Stella said. "I am already involved. I'm on the school board." She had not known that. He had not mentioned it. He spoke to Bill Hatch the next morning, and by Wednesday all 3 students were back in school. Stella did not thank him effusively because she sensed he would find that uncomfortable, but she did say, when she saw him on Thursday at the general store, "I appreciate what you did." "It was right," he said simply. "Deal doesn't get to decide what children learn. He seems to think otherwise. He's wrong." There was no heat in it, just the flat, clear certainty of a conviction that had been held long enough to become bedrock. He's wrong about most things. But he has money and land, and he's used to people agreeing with him. The trick is not agreeing. She looked at him, and something shifted in her chest, some small, carefully guarded thing that she had been protecting since Raymond Alcott, that she had been telling herself she did not need to let anyone near again. She told herself it was admiration. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself all the sensible things she had been telling herself for 2 years. None of them held against the way he looked back at her, steady and direct, with those gray eyes that hid everything and somehow gave everything away. October came in with brilliant color in the mountains to the east, and the sharp, clarifying cold that preceded winter in the high desert. The aspens on the upper slopes went gold, and then amber and then bare, and the sky on clear days was an impossible deep blue that Stella had not encountered anywhere else. She had begun to love the landscape in the way of people who come from somewhere greener and softer, and find to their surprise that the spare, massive beauty of the desert country speaks to something inside them that the green places never reached. She and Hugh Carson had fallen into a habit that neither of them had precisely planned. On Thursday afternoons, when he came to town for supplies, their paths crossed with a regularity that was probably not entirely coincidental on either side, and they would walk together for the stretch of Main Street between the general store and the corner where their directions diverged, talking about the school and the town and the territory and the books they were reading, because it turned out that Hugh Carson read extensively, which was not something she had expected, and which delighted her more than she wanted to admit. He had a small collection on a shelf in the ranch house that he had shown her once, when she had ridden out with Edna on a Sunday afternoon to see a water dispute that had developed on the eastern boundary of his property. The ranch was modest and extremely well kept, every fence lined straight, every outbuilding in sound repair, the house itself plain-sided and clean with a porch that faced the mountains. The bookshelf held a battered Shakespeare, 2 volumes of Dickens, a natural history of the North American plains, a well-worn Bible, and a copy of Moby Dick that he had apparently read 4 times. "Why Moby Dick 4 times?" she asked. "Because every time I read it I understand something different," he said. "That seems worth revisiting." She had stood in his parlor looking at his books and thinking about how thoroughly she had misjudged him in those first weeks, how she had categorized him as the quiet, capable, self-contained man who repaired windows and brought wire rope from the general store, and how that description was true and also wildly incomplete. She had also been acutely aware, standing in that room, of how much space he occupied without trying to, how the particular quality of his stillness made the air around him feel differently arranged. She had moved back toward the doorway before she let herself think about that too carefully, November brought the first hard freeze and brought also the complication that Stella had been dreading since she arrived in Dusty Creek. Raymond Alcott found her. She had been careful. She had told no one in St. Louis where she was going except her landlady, Mrs. Pierce, who was a woman of absolute discretion. But Mrs. Pierce had a daughter in Albuquerque, and the daughter had a husband who did business with men who knew men, and the West was not as vast as it looked when you were looking for someone specific. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, brought by the mail rider, and Stella read it standing at Clara's kitchen table and felt the cold settle into her that had nothing to do with November. Raymond did not threaten in direct language. He never had. His threats were architectural, built into sentences that sounded reasonable and even courteous, and that contained, in their structure, absolute menace. He was coming to Dusty Creek, the letter said, because there had been a misunderstanding between them, and he was sure that once he explained himself in person, she would see that they had a shared future that deserved a second chance. He had never called what he had done a misunderstanding. She had waited for that in the aftermath of the locked door and the 14-block walk in the cold. She had waited for the letter that said he was sorry, that acknowledged what had happened, that showed any evidence of the kind of self-examination that might mean he had changed. The letter had never come. This letter called it a misunderstanding. She burned it. She burned it in Clara's kitchen stove, and she watched the paper curl and blacken, and she made herself breathe steadily until her hands stopped trembling. She told Clara that evening because she needed to tell someone, and because Clara Finch was a woman who had survived a great deal without requiring drama from the people around her. Clara listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, and when Stella finished she said two things. The first was that Stella would stay as long as she needed to, regardless of circumstances. The second was that Hugh Carson should know. "He is on the school board," Clara said. "And he is a man people in this town listen to, including the sheriff. If this Raymond Alcott comes here looking to cause trouble, having the right people informed could matter." Stella did not want to tell Hugh. She did not want to tell Hugh because Hugh was no longer simply the man who repaired windows and walked with her on Thursdays. Hugh was the person she looked forward to seeing with a specificity and an intensity that frightened her. And telling him about Raymond felt like showing him the hidden place where all her fear and her damage lived, which was exactly the kind of vulnerability she had been refusing to allow herself since she left St. Louis. She told him on Thursday because Clara Finch was a persuasive woman, and because Stella was, beneath the caution and the careful composure, someone who ultimately made herself do the things that were right even when they were hard. They were standing near the corner of Main and 2nd. The wind had an edge to it, and the sky was a uniform pale gray, and Hugh was wearing a heavy canvas coat, and holding the reins of his roan gelding and listening to her with the full, undivided quality of attention that she had come to depend on without letting herself name it as dependency. She told him about Raymond. Not everything, not the locked door or the 14 blocks or the 2 years of carefully rebuilt self-possession that she carried everywhere like a mended piece of glass, transparent and functional but marked by where it had been broken. She told him enough. She told him about the letter and the implied threat, and the fact that Raymond was the kind of man who interpreted persistence as righteousness. Hugh was quiet for a moment after she finished. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and she pushed it back and waited for the response she always braced for, the one that treated her experience as a problem to be managed or a situation to be handled with male authority over her own agency. He said, "What do you want to do about it?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. What is the outcome you want? Because there are several options. The sheriff can be informed, which puts it on record. I can speak to him when he arrives if you want. You could write a letter through a lawyer making your position entirely clear, or some combination." His eyes were on her. "But it is your decision. I am asking what you want." Something gave way in her, some structural thing that had been holding a great deal of weight for a very long time. She did not let it collapse, but she felt it give, and she understood in that moment that she was in genuine danger with this man, not the danger she had known before, not the controlled, confined danger of Raymond Alcott's locked door, but the danger of someone who could reach something in her that she had not reached herself in a very long time. "All three," she said. "I want all three." The edge of his mouth shifted. "All right," she informed the sheriff. Hugh offered to speak to Raymond if he arrived. A letter went to a lawyer in Santa Fe by the end of the week. Stella taught her school and rode out to Hugh's ranch on Sunday afternoons with Edna, and without Edna, and sometimes alone, not because she had engineered those solitary visits, but because the ranch was a place where she found herself thinking clearly, which she had gradually come to understand was because Hugh was there. Raymond Alcott arrived in Dusty Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, which was not a Thursday, which meant that Hugh was not in town, which was the first thing that went wrong. Stella was closing up the school when the buckboard from the stagecoach stop came past, and she recognized Raymond the way you recognize something you have spent a long time hoping you would not see again. He was sitting straight-backed in the front of the buckboard beside the driver, wearing his good coat, scanning the street with the proprietary expression of a man arriving to claim something. She did not run. She had promised herself she would not run. She gathered her school bag and her coat, and she walked toward the sheriff's office with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has made a decision and intends to keep it. Sheriff Tom Briggs was a lean, laconic man in his early 50s who had been sheriff of Dusty Creek for 11 years and who, having been informed of the situation by Stella the previous week, met her at the door of his office with a look that said he had already seen the buckboard go past. "He's here," Stella said. "I see that. I want it on record that I did not invite him and do not welcome his presence." "It's already on record," Briggs said. "I wrote it down when you first told me." "You want me to speak to him first?" "Yes." Briggs went. Stella stood inside the sheriff's office and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. One of the deputies, a young man named Caleb with freckles and a nervous disposition, offered her a chair. She sat in it. The conversation between Briggs and Raymond lasted approximately 20 minutes. Stella could not hear it. When Briggs returned, he said that Mr. Alcott had been informed that his presence was noted, that Stella Dawson was a free woman with no legal obligation to see or speak to him, and that any attempt to impose himself on her would be regarded as a matter for law enforcement. He said Raymond had been polite and entirely unconvinced. "He'll try to speak to her directly," Briggs said, with the resignation of someone who had seen this kind of man before. "He's at the Cattlemen's Rest tonight. I'll keep an eye." Stella sent word to Hugh through a boy named Petey who ran messages for a nickel. Hugh was at the sheriff's office within 2 hours, which meant he had ridden hard from the ranch, which was a thing she noticed and chose not to examine too closely. "Are you all right?" was the first thing he said. "I am fine," she said, and then, because she was too tired to be anything less than honest, "I am frightened, but I am fine." He sat down in the chair across from her, and they talked through everything, what Briggs had said, what the options were, what was likely to happen next. He did not minimize what she was feeling, and he did not catastrophize it. He was exactly as steady as he always was, and she was, in that cold sheriff's office with the lamp guttering slightly in the draft from under the door, more grateful for his presence than she could find words for. Raymond approached her the next morning on her way to the school. He came out of the hotel on the south side of Main Street looking freshly barbered and entirely reasonable, which was the most dangerous version of him, the version she remembered most clearly from the beginning when she had been foolish enough to mistake his surfaces for his depth. "Stella." He said it warmly, as though they had parted on good terms, as though there had been no locked door and no walk in the cold. She stopped walking. She had decided the night before that she would not run from him, because running would give him the satisfaction of believing she was afraid enough to flee, and she was not afraid enough for that. She was afraid in the deep, architectural way, the way of someone who has survived a betrayal of trust by someone they believed they knew, but she was not afraid in the running way. "I received your letter," she said. I chose not to respond to it, which was its own response. If you have further communication for me, it should go through Sheriff Briggs. He shifted his expression to the one she recognized as wounded reasonableness. Stella, there is no need for this kind of formality between us. I just want to talk. There is every need for this kind of formality between us. She held his gaze. I am going to teach school now. If you follow me or attempt to speak to me again, the sheriff will be informed immediately. She walked past him. Her hands were not entirely steady, but she kept them at her sides and she did not look back. She heard his footsteps behind her for approximately 20 feet, then stop. Hugh was waiting at the corner of Main and 2nd. Not casually, not as though he happened to be there. He had positioned himself where Raymond would see him, which she understood was a deliberate choice. He said nothing to Raymond. He looked at her and then passed her at Raymond, and the look he gave Raymond was the look of a man who has made a clear and simple decision and will not be moved from it by any argument. Raymond Alcott did not follow her past that corner. He stayed in Dusty Creek for 3 days, during which time he drank more than was good for him at the Cattlemen's Rest, and had 2 conversations with Marcus Deal, which troubled Stella when she found out about them from Clara, because there was nothing good that could come from those 2 men finding common purpose. But on the 4th day he was on the stagecoach north, and Sheriff Briggs saw him off with the same laconic efficiency with which he approached everything, and when he came to tell Stella that the stage had departed, he said, "Men like that don't always stay gone, but they usually calculate the cost before they come back." "Thank you," Stella said. "Don't thank me for doing my job," Briggs said, and he was out the door before she could answer. December arrived, and Dusty Creek settled into the particular rhythm of a frontier town in winter, slightly slower, the cold contracting the days and driving people indoors earlier. Stella's school had a little wood stove that worked magnificently, and the children brought their lunches in tin pails, and the schoolroom smelled of chalk dust and wood smoke, and the specific, hopeful smell of children learning things. She was deeply happy in those rooms. She had not expected to be. She had come to Dusty Creek as a refuge and had found, against all her careful emotional architecture, that it was becoming home. And she was falling in love with Hugh Carson with a completeness and a helplessness that terrified her. She knew it clearly by a Thursday afternoon in mid-December when he was walking beside her on Main Street and said something quietly funny about the McGuffey Reader situation, and she laughed, genuinely laughed in the spontaneous, unguarded way she had not laughed in years, and he looked at her with an expression he could not quite contain, something open and undefended that passed across his face too quickly for him to catch it, and she felt the certainty of it settle into her like something finally going right. She was terrified of it. She spent a week being terrified of it, because she had believed in Raymond Alcott, and she had paid for that belief in a locked room and 14 cold blocks and 2 years of rebuilding herself. She had not rebuilt herself in order to give everything over to another man and call it love. She had rebuilt herself in order to be the author of her own life, to stand in her own schoolroom with her own authority and her own choices, and love was not a thing that had ever worked out to be about her own choices. It had worked out to be about someone else's choices, made over her head for her own good. She told herself all of this in the cold of her boarding house room at night, and all of it was true, and none of it touched the fact of Hugh. He asked her to dinner on the 20th of December, not a grand gesture. He appeared at the schoolhouse after her students had gone home and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "There's a good restaurant in Tierra Alta, about 12 miles east. I was thinking about riding over on Saturday. I thought you might want to come." He did not dress it up. He did not make it sound casual in a way that would allow them both to pretend it was nothing. He stood in her doorway and asked her plainly, and the hat in his hands was the only thing that betrayed any nervousness, the way he turned it once slowly by the brim. "Yes," she said. The dinner at Tierra Alta was the best meal Stella had eaten in 2 years, and they talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say. and on the ride back in the cold, clear December night with the stars extraordinary above them, Hugh reached across the space between their horses and took her hand briefly, just for a moment, and then released it, and neither of them said anything, and it was the most significant thing that had happened to her in longer than she could calculate. Christmas passed. January came in with real cold and 3 feet of snow, and the particular fierce intimacy that a frontier winter creates when people must rely on each other not as a matter of social convention, but as a matter of actual survival. Hugh rode to town to help dig out the road to the schoolhouse when it drifted, because Stella refused to suspend classes for more than a single day, and the children needed a way to get there. Stella made soup at Clara's and sent it out to the men working on the road, and when Hugh came to the door of the boarding house at the end of the day, still carrying cold off him, she brought him inside and gave him soup and cornbread and sat across from him at Clara's kitchen table in the lamplight and felt, so clearly it almost hurt, that this was the life she wanted. She kissed him first. She had not planned it and she did not think about it. He was standing in the hallway putting on his coat to leave, and she was handing him his gloves, and she simply leaned up and kissed him, briefly, cleanly on the mouth, and then stepped back and met his eyes. The look he gave her was one she would never forget for the rest of her life, something that was almost pain in its intensity, the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully contained for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. "Stella," he said, and her name in his voice was entirely different from how anyone else had ever said it. "I know," she told him. "I know." He kissed her properly then, and she let herself not be afraid, and it was nothing like the careful, managed performances of affection she had received from Raymond. It was quiet and deep and absolutely certain, and when it was done she pressed her forehead against his chest for a moment and listened to his heart and thought, with a clarity she had not felt in years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. February was the best month of Stella Dawson's life, which made what happened in March feel like a particular cruelty. Marcus Deal had been waiting. She understood that afterward, looking back. He had been watching, gathering information, building the architectural structure of a trap with the patience and deliberateness of someone who had learned that direct opposition was ineffective, and that the better strategy was to find the hidden foundation of a thing and destroy it from below. The thing Marcus Deal found in March was the detail of Stella's departure from St. Louis. He had connections. She did not know how extensive those connections were until the evening he appeared at the school board meeting, which she attended because there were curriculum matters under discussion, and laid a letter on the table in front of the assembled board members with the particular, satisfied calm of someone playing a card they have been holding for months. The letter was from Raymond Alcott. It described Stella's departure from St. Louis in the most poisonous possible terms, full of implications about her moral character, about the circumstances of their broken engagement, about choices she had allegedly made that were entirely fabricated but which were rendered in the specific, sober language of a man who had spent months constructing a plausible lie. Stella read the letter at the school board table with 6 people watching her face. She read every word. She kept her face as still as she could make it. Inside she was shaking with a cold fury that was the worst kind, the kind that comes from knowing you are entirely in the right, and that the right is not going to be enough. When she looked up, Marcus Deal was watching her with the expression of a man who has won something he is very pleased about. Hugh was watching her from the other side of the table. His face was unreadable in the way that meant he was working very hard to make it so. He had read the letter when it was passed around the table, and she had watched his jaw set, and his hands go still on the tabletop, and he had not looked at her yet, and she told herself that the stillness did not mean what she was afraid it meant. "This letter," Edna Marsh said from the head of the table, in the voice she used when she was at her most precise and most dangerous, "is from the man who came to Dusty Creek in November to harass Miss Dawson. The man whose visit was documented with Sheriff Briggs. The man who is, by her account, and by the account of every person who witnessed his behavior here, someone she left for good reason, and whose continued attempts to contact her are the actions of someone who cannot accept a clear decision. She looked at Deal. You are presenting this as evidence of something. I am asking you to explain to this board exactly what you believe it is evidence of. Deal was smooth about it. He said he was merely concerned about the character of someone entrusted with the education of the town's children. He said he had no personal animus. He said the board had a responsibility to investigate. The meeting did not resolve cleanly. There were board members who were worried, not because they believed Deal's specific accusations, but because the existence of controversy was itself uncomfortable, and because Deal had money and they lived in a town where his money had influence. The meeting ended inconclusively, which meant that nothing was decided and everything was in question, which was, Stella realized, exactly what Deal had intended. She walked home alone. Hugh tried to walk with her, and she told him she needed a moment to think, which was true, and which she regretted almost immediately, but not enough to call him back. She needed to think because she was afraid, not of losing the job, though the job mattered enormously. She was afraid of the shape of the trap, of how thoroughly Raymond's hatred of her had found its way to the one place in the world she had made something that felt like home. She was afraid of how much Dusty Creek had come to mean to her. She was afraid of what it would cost Hugh if she stayed, and the controversy continued, because she had seen enough of how these things work to know that loyalty to a woman whose reputation was being actively destroyed could damage a man in a community, particularly a man who owned land and needed relationships in that community to survive. She had been the person that someone else's choices were made over and for and about. She had promised herself never again. She sat in her room at Clara's and she thought about it for 2 days, and what she arrived at was the thing she had been most afraid of. The thought that leaving might be the most loving thing she could do for everyone, including Hugh, who had given her no reason to protect him from nothing, who had not asked her to calculate his interests and weigh them above her own, who had in fact never once made her feel that she was a burden or a liability. She arrived at this thought, and she knew it was wrong in important ways, and she held it anyway because fear is not logical, and because the hidden motive of her thinking was that she was terrified of becoming the person whose presence in someone's life cost them something. The way she had seen her father's patience and goodness slowly worn away by her mother's illness. The way she had watched one person's need become the quiet erosion of another person's life. She made the decision on a Wednesday evening, and she had the bag packed by Thursday morning. She told herself she would tell Hugh clearly and completely, and then she would go, and he would understand, and it would hurt, but it would be right. She had been wrong about nearly all of that. She stood in the doorway of the stable on that sharp March morning with her bag and her rehearsed goodbye, and the word goodbye was still forming on her lips when Hugh's hands found the cinch strap, and his boot hit the stable floor, and she understood, with the comprehensive clarity of a woman who has been lying to herself with great dedication and very limited success, that she had profoundly underestimated him. She had underestimated the force of his intention. She had underestimated the depth of what he felt. She had underestimated the particular, unyielding quality of a man who had already made one terrible mistake in the direction of letting someone go without fighting for them. You are not going to tell me about your dark past with Raymond Alcott and the fear underneath all of this calculation, Hugh said, turning from the horse to face her fully now, and then get on a stagecoach without me having something to say about it. You cannot simply follow me wherever I go. I am not following you wherever you go. I am following you onto whatever stagecoach you are planning to board and making you listen to me before you board it. He came toward her across the stable, and the quality of his movement was different from his usual unhurried steadiness. There was an urgency in it that she had never seen from him, and it made the breath catch in her throat. Deal set a trap. You know he set a trap. You know Raymond's letter is a fabrication. Edna knows it. Briggs knows it. You are running because you are afraid of what your staying will cost me, which means you have decided to make a choice on my behalf without asking me whether I want that choice made." The accuracy of this was devastating. She pressed her lips together. "Is that what happened?" he pressed. "Yes," she said, because she had stopped being able to lie to him sometime around January when she wasn't paying attention. "And did it occur to you that what you're leaving will cost me might be considerably higher than whatever deal can manufacture?" The rawness in his voice was the thing that finally broke through the last of it. She had not heard that rawness before. She had seen what lay beneath his composure, but she had not heard it spoken in that stripped-down, direct way, and it reached the place in her that all her careful architectural fear-building had been specifically designed to protect. "Hugh," she said, and her voice broke on the single syllable. "Don't tell me goodbye," he said. "Tell me what you're actually afraid of." She set her bag down on the floor of the stable. The morning light came through the gaps in the walls and laid its gold lines across the straw between them, and she looked at him, this man who had repaired her windows and walked beside her and listened to her and never once tried to make her smaller, and she told him the truth. She told him about her father and mother, about watching love become obligation become erosion. She told him about Raymond not as the story of what had been done to her, but as the story of what she had failed to see, the dark past of her own blindness, the way she had overridden instinct and observation for the sake of not being alone. She told him that what she felt for him was the most real thing in her life, and that this was precisely the problem, that real things could be destroyed, that she had been destroyed before, and she did not think she would survive it again. He listened to all of it. He stood in the stable in the early morning with his horse behind him already saddled, already ready to go wherever she was going, and he listened until she was finished. Then he said, "My wife died in 1874. The air changed. She had not known. She had known there was something in his history that had weight. She had sensed it in the particular quality of his restraint, but she had not known this. Her name was Anna," he said. "She came with me from Missouri when I filed on the land. She died of typhoid fever that first winter. We had been married 14 months. His voice was level, and she understood that this levelness cost him a great deal. "After she died, I stayed. I built the ranch. I convinced myself that was enough, that work was enough, that I didn't need more than what I had built. And then you arrived in Dusty Creek and fixed a window frame, and I realized that I had been surviving, not living, for 4 years, and I am not going back to that." The silence in the stable was complete. The roan horse shifted and blew a slow breath, and the straw rustled, and outside the town was beginning its day, the distant sounds of commerce and mourning carrying in the cold air. "You should have told me," she said softly. "I know. I was protecting myself, which is the same thing you have been doing." He came the rest of the distance between them and stopped close enough that she could see the exact quality of the certainty in his gray eyes. "We are both afraid. I am not asking you to stop being afraid. I am asking you not to make my decisions for me. I am asking you to stay. I am asking you to let me be someone you trust." She looked at him for a long time. The gold light moved across the straw between them. She thought about every story she had ever told herself about what love was and what it cost and what it required. She thought about her father and her mother, and she thought about how her father, even in the hard years, had never once acted as though her mother's need was an imposition he regretted. She thought about how she had turned that into fear. She thought about Hugh saddling his horse before she finished saying goodbye. "I am not going to stop being terrified," she said. "I know. And I am going to need you to keep asking me what I want rather than deciding, every time." "That is not a hardship," he said. "It's how I prefer to operate." She breathed in. She breathed out. She picked up the traveling bag from the floor of the stable. She put it down again. "I should probably tell Edna I am not leaving," she said. "She would appreciate that. She has invested considerable effort in you." "Are you going to do anything about Deal?" "Yes, but that is a conversation for after you are no longer standing in this stable deciding whether to run." She looked at him once more, and the last of the structural fear gave way entirely, not in a collapse but in the way of something carefully set down when you have finally reached the table. She stepped forward and put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and felt the warmth of him, the solid reality of a person who was exactly who he appeared to be. "I am staying," she said. He covered her hand with his. His thumb moved slowly over her knuckles. He said nothing else for a moment, and she understood that the silence was the answer to everything, the specific, eloquent silence of a man who does not need to fill space with words when the truth has already been spoken. Then he said, "Come on, I'll buy you breakfast before school." She laughed, and it was the unguarded laugh, the real one, and she felt it move through the whole of her. They walked out of the stable together into the March morning, leaving the traveling bag behind. What happened with Marcus Deal was not resolved quickly or simply, because the things Marcus Deal had built in Dusty Creek over years of money and influence could not be dismantled in a week. But they were dismantled, which was the more important point. Edna Marsh had not been sitting idle during the 2 days Stella spent in her room at Clara's deciding to run. Edna had been gathering signatures. She had spoken to every parent of every child in Stella's school, and she had spoken to them with the precise, measured intensity of a woman who understands that a community is ultimately made of its members' willingness to stand for something. And she had asked them plainly whether they wanted their children's education run by a schoolteacher of demonstrated skill and integrity, or by Marcus Deal's opinions about what was suitable. She had brought 12 signed letters to the school board meeting that was called for the second week in March. 12 letters from parents in support of Stella Dawson, attesting to what their children had learned, to the quality of the teaching, to the character of the woman. Hugh presented his own statement as a board member, directly refuting the claims in Raymond's letter point by point, citing documented evidence, citing the sheriff's record of Raymond's behavior in November, citing the specific timeline that made clear Raymond Alcott was a man with a motive to destroy Stella's reputation, not a credible source of information about it. The sheriff attended and presented his own documentation. Marcus Deal sat on the other side of the table and watched his carefully constructed trap disassembled piece by piece, and when it was over and the board voted 4-1 in support of Stella's continued employment, the expression on his face was not quite what Stella had expected. It was not rage. It was the particular, stripped-down look of a man who has discovered that the tools he has always relied on do not work when they come up against something solid. He left the meeting without speaking. He did not, as far as anyone could tell, attempt any further action against Stella's position at the school. He continued to sit on the town council and to own his land and to be exactly what he had always been, a man of money and self-interest in a town that was gradually becoming too established to be shaped by any single person's will. And Stella found that she could live in the same town with Marcus Deal without it consuming her, which was its own kind of victory. Raymond Alcott sent one more letter in April. Stella turned it over in her hands, unopened, and then walked it to the stove and put it in, and stood watching it burn with the calm of someone who has finished with a chapter and put the book on a high shelf. April in the territory was the beginning of something that felt, every year Stella lived there, like a particular kind of gift, the desert blooming with a brief, extravagant beauty that people from greener places never expected and always gasped at. The cactus flowers and the wildflowers and the impossibly blue sky, and the mountains still carrying their snow on the upper peaks, while the valley went green and gold. And she rode out to Hugh's ranch on the Sunday afternoons, and she taught her school, and she and Hugh walked on Thursday afternoons and ate dinner twice a week, and spent Sunday evenings reading on the porch of the ranch house with the mountains in front of them, and said the things that people say when they have stopped being afraid to say them. He proposed on a Sunday evening in late April with the sun going down behind the mesa and the sky doing what the New Mexico sky did at dusk, the red and orange and the deep purple coming up from the east, and he did not get down on one knee, which was not his way, but he sat beside her on the porch bench and turned to her with the full, direct quality of his attention and said, "I want to marry you. I want you to live here with me, and I want us to build this life together." I am asking." "You are always asking," she said, and she was smiling, and she could feel the smile in every part of her. "That's the agreement." "Yes," she said, "that was never in question." They were married in June of 1879 at the Dusty Creek Church, which had received its second coat of whitewash in May and which looked, Edna observed with satisfaction, like it finally believed in itself. Clara Finch wept with a contained dignity that fooled no one. The 14 children from Stella's school attended and presented a card they had all signed, the signatures ranging from careful, practiced cursive to one child's enthusiastic scrawl that covered approximately a quarter of the card. Sheriff Briggs stood in the back and nodded with the expression of a man attending an outcome he had considered likely for some time. Edna stood beside Stella at the altar as her witness, because there was no one else in Dusty Creek, and perhaps in any place, who had Edna's particular combination of sharp intelligence and absolute loyalty. And Stella had come to understand that the fierce, demanding woman who had assessed her posture at the stagecoach stop had been, from that first moment, entirely in her corner. Hugh's face when she walked down the aisle of that small, whitewashed church was the face she would carry with her for the rest of her life as the single clearest image of everything she had almost lost. Open and certain and undisguised, all the contained intensity of him given freely, nothing held back. She walked toward him and she did not look away. The ranch became hers in the way that places become yours when you stop visiting them and start living in them, when you know the particular sound the wind makes coming around the east corner at night, when you know which board on the porch steps wants attention each spring, when the view of the mountains from the kitchen window is the first thing you look for in the morning and the last thing before dark. She kept teaching school, because that was never in question. Hugh never suggested otherwise. She rode to town every weekday and she came home to the ranch, and she brought schoolwork home in her bag and graded it at the kitchen table while he read. And on the evenings when neither of them felt like talking they sat in the same room in their respective silences, and that silence was, she understood, its own kind of conversation. She wrote letters to Edna from 10 feet away and left them on the school board meeting table, and Edna wrote letters back. It was their private joke for years. She wrote to Clara when Clara's oldest daughter came back to Dusty Creek after her marriage ended, and Clara suddenly had a houseful again and needed both practical advice and to laugh. She did not write to anyone in St. Louis. She did not need to. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy, loud, demanding boy they named James Thomas Carson, James for Hugh's father, Thomas for no particular reason except that they both liked the sound of it. He arrived with the stubbornness of someone who has already formed strong opinions before he has even fully arrived in the world, and Hugh held him in the hours after the birth with an expression on his face that was new in Stella's experience of him, something that had no composure in it at all, something so unguarded it was almost frightening in its tenderness. "He looks like you," Stella said from the bed, which was not entirely true but which she felt strongly. "He looks like a very small, very angry person who wants something," Hugh said. "That is both of us." He looked at her over the baby's head and laughed, genuinely, fully, the laugh that she had been working toward for 2 years and which still felt, every time, like a particular personal accomplishment. James grew into a dark-haired, gray-eyed, relentlessly curious child who wanted to know how everything worked, and who followed his father around the ranch from the time he could walk with the focused attention of someone conducting a prolonged apprenticeship. He brought snakes into the kitchen twice before Stella established a formal policy, and he once let out 3 horses that were not his to let out, and he asked questions that Stella felt were philosophically challenging for a 6-year-old, and which she answered as fully as she could, because she was a schoolteacher, and also because she recognized his questions as the right kind. He attended his mother's school, which was both the obvious choice and a situation that required certain mutually agreed-upon ground rules. The second child arrived in 1883, a girl they named Clara Edna Carson, the two names placed side by side as a declaration of appreciation for the two women who had been most essential in the years that had shaped everything. And Clara Finch and Edna Marsh were both informed of the naming at approximately the same time, and had different but equally characteristic responses. Clara wept openly and was not dignified about it at all, and then made a magnificent quilt. Edna said it was a perfectly good name and asked if the girl had good posture. She did, eventually. She was 3 weeks old and posture had not yet entered her skill set, but Edna was satisfied to hear the prospects were promising. Clara Edna Carson grew into a person who was, in the estimation of everyone who knew her, almost entirely her mother's daughter, with Stella's directness and Stella's determination, and Stella's gift for making any room she walked into feel like a place where important things were about to happen. She had Hugh's gray eyes, and she had, Stella observed when Clara was approximately 4 years old, Hugh's talent for absolute stillness in the middle of chaos, the ability to go very quiet and very certain at exactly the moment when everyone else was unsettled. That is going to be either extremely useful or very difficult to parent, Hugh observed, watching his daughter calmly redirect a situation that had involved a goat, a broken fence, and her older brother's most creative excuse. Both, Stella said. Definitely both. Marcus Deal sold his cattle operation in 1882 and moved to Arizona Territory, which Dusty Creek received as information without particular ceremony. The town had grown enough by then that his departure created a conversation about land use and a few business opportunities rather than any noticeable change in the social or political atmosphere, which seemed to Stella, when she thought about it, like its own kind of verdict on how much of his power had been real and how much had been simply the assumption that no one would oppose him. The school grew. She hired an assistant teacher in 1884, a young man named Philip Greer, who had come west from Ohio, specifically, because he wanted to teach in the territory, and who turned out to be precisely as good at the work as he had presented himself to be, which Stella noted with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been burned enough times to appreciate confirmed expectations. The school expanded into a second room and then, with the town's resources, into a proper 2-room schoolhouse with a bell that rang on all 4 strokes. Edna Marsh died in the winter of 1886. She died in her own bed with her accounts in perfect order and her opinions fully intact, having spent her final weeks issuing instructions to various people about various matters, with the composed authority she had brought to everything for 30 years in Dusty Creek. She left Stella a complete set of McGuffey readers and a letter that said, in Edna's characteristic economy of sentiment, that she had come to think of Stella as the best thing the school board had done in its history, and that she expected Stella to maintain the standard. Stella carried that letter in her pocket for 3 days before she put it away carefully in the cedar box where she kept things she wanted to protect from time. Hugh sat with her on the porch on the evening after Edna's funeral, and they did not talk much, and the silence was the kind that only exists between people who have spent enough years together that silence has developed its own full vocabulary. After a long while he reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the night come down over the mountains. She approved of you, Stella said. That first day, she was assessing you the minute you started walking toward her. I know, he said. I was being assessed. I passed by a very narrow margin. She told me eventually what the margin was. He waited. She said you asked what she needed rather than telling her what you would do. She said that was the first sign you understood how things actually worked. He was quiet for a moment. Edna was usually right about people. Always, Stella said. She was always right. She was promoted to head of the school board in 1887, which she accepted with the kind of wary amusement of someone who recognizes that they have become, without entirely planning it, the version of a person they most admired. She ran the board with the combination of practical rigor and genuine warmth that had characterized her classroom for nearly a decade. And the school under her oversight became something that people in the territory pointed to as an example of what frontier education could be when it was treated as the serious, civilization-building endeavor it actually was. James was 9 and Clara was 4 and Stella was 36 years old, and she had been in Dusty Creek for 9 years. And on the evening when she sat on the porch with Hugh and looked at the mountains and thought about all of this, what she felt was not the cautious, constructed sense of safety she had arrived at after Raymond Alcott and the walk in the cold. What she felt was something entirely different, something that had been built from the outside in and from the inside out simultaneously, not the avoidance of danger but the full, irreversible embrace of the life she had made. She felt it particularly on Thursdays. They still walked on Thursdays, when Hugh came to town for supplies, when she was done with school for the week. They walked along Main Street, which was a better street than it had been in 1878, paved with flagstone for most of its length, lined with established businesses, with a proper bank and a second doctor and a hotel that was not called the Cattleman's Rest anymore. And as they walked, she would say something about what had happened at school, and he would listen with the full, present quality of attention that had undone her in the first place. And she would think, not every time but often enough, about the morning in the stable, and the bag on the floor, and the goodbye she had not finished saying. She had never finished saying it. She was grateful for that. She was grateful for Hugh's hands on the cinch strap before she had the word out of her mouth, for the particular quality of his certainty that had moved faster than her fear. She told him that once directly, one of the Thursday evenings in late spring when they were sitting on the porch after supper, and the children were inside, and the mountains were the color of old bronze in the last light. "I am grateful," she said, "that you were already saddling the horse." He looked at her. "Before I finished, you were already moving." She looked back at him. "I would have gotten on that stage. I would have spent years being right about all the wrong things." He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing the exact weight of words. "You would have come back," he said. "I like to think so, but I am not certain." "I am," he said. And there was the certainty, the old bedrock certainty, the kind that came from knowing something at the level below words. "You were already staying, you just hadn't said it yet." She thought about that. She thought about the word goodbye on her lips that had never arrived at its destination, about the bag on the stable floor. She thought about all the ways a person protects themselves from the things they most want, the elaborate architecture of caution and self-sufficiency, and managed expectations that she had built over years and which had, in the end, not held against 31 years old and gray eyes and the particular quality of a man who listened when she spoke. "Maybe," she said, "but I was going to make myself go anyway." "I know," he said. "That is why I saddled the horse." A third child came in 1889, unexpected and entirely welcome, a boy they named William, who arrived with the apparent intention of making as much noise as possible, and who vindicated this intention over the following years with exceptional consistency. William was different from James and Clara in the way that third children sometimes are, less formed by observation of his parents, and more formed by the specific, chaotic curriculum of having two opinionated older siblings. He was funny and loud and irrepressible, and he got into more trouble by the age of 5 than James and Clara combined, and he had Stella's dark eyes rather than Hugh's gray ones, and he had, Stella saw clearly, a particular lightness of spirit that was entirely his own. Hugh watched this third child with an expression that was, Stella thought, the expression of a man counting gifts and finding the count higher than expected. She said this to him once, and he said that was about right. The new century came at the end of 1899, and with it, the particular awareness that the world the Carsons had built their lives in was changing in ways that were sometimes a loss and sometimes an expansion, and were always, when you were honest, both simultaneously. The railroad had come through the territory. The town had grown beyond anything it had been in 1878. There were telegraph wires now, and the school had 4 rooms and 2 full teachers, and Stella had retired from daily teaching at 47 to run the board and write curriculum guidelines and consult for the 3 other schools that had appeared in the county in the 2 decades since she had arrived on a stagecoach with a traveling bag and the ruins of a life she was leaving behind. James was 19 and working the ranch beside his father, having made it clear at approximately age 12 that the ranch was his intention, and having demonstrated, in the years since, that the intention was backed by both ability and genuine love for the land. Clara was 16 and had Edna Marsh's quality of absolute clarity about the important things, and was heading toward a future that Stella suspected would involve either teaching or law or both, in some combination that would be entirely characteristic and probably spectacular. William was 10 and currently being forbidden from keeping a prairie dog in the house, a prohibition he was challenging with considerable creative ingenuity. On a Thursday evening in March of 1900, 22 years after Stella had arrived in Dusty Creek, she sat on the porch of the ranch house with her husband and looked at the mountains and thought about none of it specifically, which was the particular pleasure of a life that had become so completely inhabited that its various components were no longer separate landmarks to be identified and appreciated, but simply the atmosphere in which everything happened. "What are you thinking?" Hugh asked. "Nothing in particular," she said. "Everything at once." He nodded. This was an answer he had received before and had always understood. The mountains were the same mountains they had always been, the same peaks carrying their snow in winter, and shedding it in spring, and standing in the summer heat like witnesses to everything that happened in the valley below. The same mountains she had ridden toward on that Sunday afternoon with Edna in October of 1878. The same mountains she had looked at from the kitchen window every morning for 22 years. The mountains that had become, over those years, part of the specific geography of what she meant when she used the word home. She thought about 17-year-old Stella Dawson in Cincinnati, who had wanted to be a teacher and had believed in books and in the power of giving children the tools to think clearly. She thought about 27-year-old Stella in St. Louis, locked in a man's house and walking 14 blocks in the cold. She thought about 28-year-old Stella on a stagecoach heading west with a bag and a job advertisement, and the most uncertain future she had ever faced. She thought about a schoolhouse in a small town at the edge of Mesa Country, and a man on a ladder outside the east-facing windows, and a gray-eyed directness that had unraveled every careful thing she had built around herself. She thought about a stable in March and a bag on the floor, and the word goodbye that had never arrived. Hugh's hand was warm over hers on the arm of the bench. The mountains held their color in the last light, going from bronze to deep red to purple, and she watched them change and let herself simply be in the life she had chosen, the life that had chosen her back, in the specific, whole, irreplaceable thing that she and Hugh Carson had built from scratch in the high desert of the New Mexico territory. "Hugh," she said. "Yes. I am glad I did not get on that stage." "I know," he said. "So am I, and I am glad you were already saddling the horse." She felt him shift beside her, the slight movement of a man settling more fully into a moment. And when she glanced at him, she found him looking at the mountains with the particular expression she had spent 22 years learning to read, the one that looked like stillness and contained, under all its surface calm, something so complete it had no need of words. His thumb moved over her knuckles, slow and certain, and the mountains caught the last of the sun and went from purple to deep, luminous blue, and the air smelled of sage and the faint, particular sweetness of the high desert at the end of a day. And somewhere inside the house, William was making the noise of a 10-year-old boy being denied a prairie dog with considerable conviction. Stella laughed. Hugh laughed. And the evening came down over the valley, warm and soft, and the horses shifted in the stable, and the mountains held their ground against the sky the way they always had and always would, and the life that had been built there, from a window frame and a Thursday afternoon and a goodbye that never finished and a horse already saddled, sat full and complete and entirely itself in the dark.